It's live now.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this Sunday afternoon. My name is Louisa Durante. I am a board member of the Canada-Tibet Committee. Today we're having an online panel discussion about the importance of having Tibetans be involved on different levels of the Canadian government to promote and to push Tibetan issues within the Canadian government. So we have an exciting lineup here for about an hour. We'll be taking questions. We're going to be hearing from 5 different panelists. So it's great that you can join us. I mentioned earlier that I'm a board member of the CTC and have been involved for a long time. Well, some of you might be asking, what is the CTC? So the CTC is the Canada-Tibet Committee. We were founded in 1987. As an organization, we serve to protect and promote Tibetan human rights and democratic freedoms. We monitor the developments within Tibet itself, and we conduct a lot of advocacy here in Canada, really to promote Tibetan human rights and democratic freedoms. It's one of the main things we do as an organization is advocate for Tibetan human rights and democratic freedoms. And we do this in a lot of ways. One of the ways we're doing that is what we're doing today, an online panel discussion with a series of Tibetan youth that have in different ways been involved and have roles within the Canadian government to try to push and promote Tibetan human rights and freedoms. So this is going to be a really interesting panel discussion. I thank you all for being here with us today. We have a lot of speakers, a lot of interesting experiences, a lot of insights into the importance of taking on these roles within the Canadian government and having this exposure. So we're going to start a little bit about why we're doing this and why it's important to share these experiences. At this time, of course, we know there's a lot of news about China-related issues that we're hearing about internationally. How does it fit into what we're trying to do as an organization and pushing forward and keeping Tibet in the spotlight as much as possible? The experiences of all these youth are really important, and we'd like them to share the ways that they've been involved through their internships to be able to really push forward the agenda on different ways. So we have a great lineup. So we're going to start first with Gafael. So Gafael here is with us, and I'm just going to introduce you. So we're going to introduce all the speakers, and then we'll have questions after each speaker. And then at the end, we'll also have some time for questions. So as I mentioned earlier, that all the panelists have worked with the Canadian government at different levels, which is a really interesting experience actually to see how the system works from inside. The panel discussion is called Being a Part of the System. Well, there's many different systems, but we're really talking about the Canadian political system and how we function here internally within Canada. So Gafael is a parliamentary assistant to the co-chair of Parliamentary Friends of Tibet, MP Garnet Genius. Thank you, Gafael, for joining us today. As an assistant to the MP who is strongly involved with China-related files, as we know, we've seen MP in the news, very much there and very much active in the news and news. Could you talk to us a bit about your experience and about how Tibet advocates can mainstream issues in an ongoing conversation on China and in Canada?
Yeah, absolutely. Like Lisa said, I'm a parliamentary assistant in the office of MP Garnet Genius, who is currently the shadow minister in federal parliament for multiculturalism and Canada-China relations. So I essentially support MP Genius with any of the work he's involved with at any given moment as a Canadian MP. And this incidentally includes preparing briefing notes, research. Much of that research happens to be China related just because of his portfolio and the things he's interested in, legislative drafting, anything that might be necessary for the operation of the federal office. And interestingly, a big part of why I wanted to work with MP Genius in particular is because of his work relating to China. So he's been a longstanding advocate for human rights in China and not just Tibetan issues, but Falun Gong and Uyghur issues for quite a while. So, I feel lucky to be involved in my current capacity where I have a chance to work on these issues that I genuinely care about. So when it comes to how Tibetans might be able to push for meaningful change with regards to China currently, I think that we're currently living through a unique period in the history of relations between just democratic nations in general and China. The coronavirus, as well as China's increasingly assertive foreign policy agenda, has brought a new international focus on China and the international dangers posed by the communist regime. And in Canada in particular, the reality of this danger has been particularly palpable. As of late, with the detention and charges laid against Canadians Michael Kovrig and Spavor, which have been in the news a lot lately, and in addition to that kind of international danger, there's a newfound recognition in the domestic repression that occurs within China as well, with news of internment camps in Xinjiang, which is sort of forcing Uyghurs to be held in these so-called re-education camps, and also with the recent suite of national security legislation in Hong Kong. All these things are drawing international criticism. So in this context, I would say it's unsurprising that there's a renewed interest among governments in re-examining their relations with China. And this re-examination, as of late, includes taking into consideration human rights concerns and concerns about China's other domestic issues. So I would say, in this context, there's sort of a renewed space for discussion about Tibet and related issues. And I'm glad to be a part of that in the capacity I am working as a parliamentary aide, and it's an exciting time in that respect. There's room for advocating for these issues, and for anybody that's interested in pushing for Tibet, I'd recommend getting involved in whatever capacity, writing letters to your MPs, to your representatives at any political level, and letting them know about your concerns, because at this time and at this moment in history, there is a real appetite for hearing about them.
Great, thank you, Gatha. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about how Tibet supporters can best leverage the newly established Interparliamentary Alliance on China. And this is something that, the MP Garnet-Jenis, of course, is a co-chair of this alliance. What are your thoughts about that?
So the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, or IPAC for short, is, for those of you that don't know, is a new international alliance of legislators whose mission is to foster a deeper collaboration between like-minded democratic legislators on the issue of China. So its activities fall into 5 broad areas, which are safeguarding international rules-based order, upholding human rights, promoting trade fairness, strengthening security, and finally protecting national integrity. So IPAC, as this sort of new international entity, is a new development in international political coordination on China, and it's sort of, in my view, signals a growing consensus in the need for a broadly tougher stance on China, and that includes on human rights issues and the CCP's treatment of its ethnic minorities. So, with IPAC being new on the scene, I think there's plenty of room to leverage IPAC's general mission, which includes concern for human rights in China and with regards to minorities such as Tibetans and Uyghurs. So I think it's definitely a good time to talk to your parliamentarians, send them emails, let them know about IPAC, because this is a new organization. They're taking members, and I think, like I said earlier, there's a real appetite for these issues just generally, and if you can make your concerns heard to your representatives, IPAC is definitely a good way of advancing this issue, the issues that you might care about, whether it be Tibetans or Uyghurs. It's a new initiative, and I think there's plenty of room for new members as well.
Great, thank you, Gathal. And related to that question is, how do you think that Tibetan advocates can actually try to do something about the current unease that we're experiencing in Canada regarding China and this policy, but also Chinese foreign policy in general? Any thoughts about that and what we can do, what Tibet advocates can do generally?
Right. Well, I would just, I guess, reiterate that this is kind of a unique historical context we're in. There's a renewed interest in re-examining relations with China pretty much across the board, all over the world. And I think it's an ideal time to make your concerns, particularly as they relate to Tibetan issues, heard to your representatives, and really push them to take up these issues. Let them know that these are important issues to you, because there's sort of a general consensus that things as they stand with China aren't adequate, and human rights in particular have become a big issue. So I think now is the ideal time to push these issues and let your representatives know that you care about them.
Great, Gathal, thank you. That's really comes back to the importance of being able to speak out and exercise our democratic rights here in Canada, where we can go to our MPs and we can talk to people directly and try to get our voice heard. So that's extremely important. Thank you for those insights, as well as action points actually for all of you to be able to follow up on and to make sure that our voices do get heard. So our next speaker is Yundan Amishing. Yundan is a consistency assistant to the city councillor, Gord Perks, and a chair of SFT, Students for Free Tibet Canada. Thank you, Yundan, for joining us today. Yundan, as chair of the SFT Canada, could you talk to us about your experience and about the opportunities and challenges of promoting Tibet issues in Canada?
Thank you for the introduction, Louisa. I'm Yundan. I work at Councillor Gord Perks' office as a constituency assistant. Before I start, I just wanted to preface my comments with sort of acknowledging that we are settlers on Indigenous land. We're on Turtle Island, even though Tibetans were forced off of our land and forced to migrate and be settlers, still benefit from this system. And the title suggests, as we are part of the system, I do think that being part of the system means that we have to be even more critical, that we have to, do even more work of unlearning and being critical of the system. So I just wanted to preface my comments with that. In terms of your questions, in terms of opportunities and challenges, I think that the fact that we have a very large Tibetan population in Parkdale High Park is a huge sort of opportunity. We in the Parkdale area, Tibetans get to sort of shape the discourse around what is discussed and what's the political climate of that area. And I think us being the sort of the largest concentration of Tibetans outside of Asia is a huge potential that we have to change that discourse in that area. But at the same time, the challenges also come from the fact that there's not a lot of Tibetans across the different ridings in Canada, and we still have to do the work of sort of engaging MPs. Not everyone's like Garnet Jennis, for example, MP Garnet Jennis. So we still have to do that work of engaging different MPs from across the country. Some other sort of opportunities and challenges, they sort of go hand in hand. In Canada, for example, we have a very diverse population. We have members from, Uyghur population in Hong Kong, and we are able to sort of, there's a large network of people that are doing work that we are, which is challenging the Chinese government and sort of, working together to do that. So I think organizations like Canada-Hong Kong Link, Federation for Democracy in China, East Turkestan Association of Canada, all those organizations, we have that network in Canada that not necessarily everyone has across the world. On a sort of more local level, recently, or in the last couple of years, Dechen, who's also on the call, was the president of the SFT chapter at U of T St. George. We hosted, and she's also serving with me on the board, and we hosted Dr. Lobsa Sangye Sikyong, and at the time there were so many Chinese sort of international students that have a lot of sway in the campus community that blocked the school doors, that sang Chinese national anthem, and that really put a lot of pressure on the Tibetans and attendance of the event. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, on a local level as well in those campuses, which we as SFT Canada support. I think a great opportunity that we have is the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations, that they had their first meeting this January, and MP Garnet is on it. And I think that's And that's a huge opportunity for Canadians and Canadian activists that want to bring down sort of China and sort of challenge their oppression. So yeah, that's some of the opportunities and challenges that I see as Canadians.
It's interesting that you mentioned about having a network, the different network that already exists, for example, that try to support democratic freedoms within China, whether it be the Uyghurs or whether it be the Chinese Democratic Freedom Link. Are there other organizations, or are there other ways, other types of organizations that perhaps the Tibetan community could link to? Like, for example, environmental ones or trade organizations, or can we think beyond, for example, the more obvious ones? What are your thoughts about that in terms of trying to broaden the network and try to gain more support nationally for the Tibetans?
Thank you for the question. I think firstly, I want to acknowledge that Canada Tibet community does a great job of networking really well with these different organizations, the aforementioned organizations. I've been in several meetings where, all these organizations, we sort of brainstorm and come together to sort of work together. And I think during the pandemic, a lot of us are working in silos. So we do know the difficulty of sort of trying to come up with a whole thing, on our own. So having that opportunity to work together is super important. That being said, Tibetan issue is so multifaceted. If I may, I think the Chinese government is, really just they're very thorough with the way they oppress the people inside Tibet, China, Hong Kong, and I think there's a lot of different opportunities. For example, if you're interested in the climate movement, Tibet has a huge issue in terms of climate because it is considered the third pole of the world. Waters from its glaciers, go to 1/3 of the world's population. So China is damming them. China is redirecting it, causing environmental degradation at the same time, sort of using it as political leverage. So there's opportunity in terms of climate. If you are into women's rights, reproductive rights, there are cases of Tibetans that are being forced to sterilize inside Tibetan nomad women that are being forced to sterilize. There's that. If you're into internet security, data breach, like China is notorious for its apps that are that have data security breaches, that have they have firewalls inside China. So there's so many different ways that we can tackle the China issue in different contexts, in different spaces. So I think it's not limited to, just human rights. It just goes way beyond that. It's much bigger. Yeah.
That's wonderful, actually. And one of the things that I was thinking about as well was that how do we bring this scope beyond the Tibetan community? So of course, as you mentioned earlier in your discourse, that there's many Tibetans here. It's one of the largest populations outside of Asia. But how do we really garner the interests and the motivation of Canadians that are outside of the community, which is extremely important in terms of building solidarity, in terms of ensuring that it also can be promoted and pushed in different ways? Do you have any other thoughts? I mean, you mentioned some really key points about gender, women, also about the environmental issues that are experienced. Have you had any kind of experience with that yourself in terms of branching out with other, I guess, in terms of other organizations?
Yeah, for sure. I think time is like one of the most important resources. So putting that time to sort of go to those events, putting that time to sort of show your solidarity and not just expect people to come to your thing and not go to others events, movements, not show up at all. I don't think it doesn't work that way. So time is of the essence, and it's not rocket science. It's pretty simple. It is, arming yourself with some of those knowledge about those different current events, about those different, issues that are happening around the world, and sort of building those alliances on shared resources and shared knowledge, and not sort of just expecting people to come to you. I think that's what it is about, putting that work and time and energy. I know it's not possible for everyone, but I think there's opportunity for the Tibetan community to do more in that sense.
Absolutely. So building connections, building partnerships, relationships, really to strengthen what we're trying to get across in terms of pushing forward Tibetan democratic freedoms and human rights, which is great, which is really important. So thank you for that. Our next speaker is going to be Tenzin Shoki. So Tenzin is a constituency assistant to the PFT, Parliamentary Friends of Tibet, with Chair Arif Virani. Thank you very much for joining us today. Tenzin, as PFT coordinator, because you've been doing lots of coordinating, of course, as you work with MP Arif, as PFT coordinator for the last few years, could you talk to us a bit about your experience with PFT, Parliamentary Friends of Tibet, and about the challenges and opportunities promoting Tibet issues at the federal level.
Hi, Lisa. So thank you for the introduction. Based on the topic as an insider within the system, so I'm going to talk about my experience as a Tibetan working at the federal level. So first of all, thank you CTC, Shirabala, and everyone at CTC for hosting this and being, CTC is one of my biggest, one of the organizations that I work very, very closely with as a federal assistant to the PFD chair. And also this little panel discussion actually gave me a lot of happiness, because just seeing everyone here, all the Tibetans now working at different levels of government. We have someone at the city level, we have someone at the provincial level, and I'm so happy that I'm not the only person working at the federal level. Now we have Gaffel, who has just recently joined and is working for MP Garnett. So I'm really, really happy to see such young, passionate, driven people, actually Tibetans working at different levels of the government. So good luck, everybody. Teshtelek. I know also today is Thagar, so Thagar Teshtelek, everyone. So based on the topic, I'm just going to talk about to be an insider, to be part of the system, what drives me and what makes me advocate for certain issues as a Tibetan working, right? So my job primarily is that I, first of all, work as a constituency assistant to an MP who is part of the government right now, and who also is the representative for the largest concentrated Tibetan area in all of North America, right, outside of India. So I, on top of being a constituency assistant, I'm also the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet coordinator. I'm also an outreach stakeholders, outreach liaison for Parkdale, for all of Parkdale. So I wear many hats. This job actually gave me a lot of perspective and in-depth understanding. Like before I became a political assistant, I actually used to work as an assistant director in movies. So it's very similar to that, like the analogy is that in the past when I used to go watch a movie, I'll be like, hey, I don't like this thing, this person didn't act well, this movie sucks. So, like you have a very judgmental way of looking at things, right? And then when I started working as an assistant director, I'm way more now, what do you say, thankful. And when I look at the work, I'm not very judgmental and I'm not very like opinionated now, because I know what goes behind the scenes. So this is very similar. This work is also very, very similar. When you're on the sidelines, it's easy to point and give opinions on what can be done. And when you're working in the system, it's very different. So for me, primarily what drives me, unlike everyone on this panel, I was born in Tibet, I was raised in Tibet, I've been a firsthand sort of, I've experienced when, Tibet had our first major uprisings in 1988 or 1989, and then I went to India and lived through a lot of adversities, being away from family and, parents, growing up in a boarding school. So all of this became sort of my driving force to do what I do right now, to be who I am. And this sort of motivates me and guides me into doing what I do. But then being in the job, like I'm very passionate about Tibetan cause and Tibetan freedom, I know like the movement and everything. But then when you're part of the system, you also have to understand that the system works on very, very different, like there's 500 different factors that influences that in the system, right? So being aware of that is one of the biggest lessons I have learned. And also, this work can be very partisan, because there is a lot of partisan overtone attached to it, especially when you're working for a particular MP who is part of a particular party. But then as a Tibetan working for a Parliamentary Friends of Tibet chair, you also have to let go of that partisan overtone and be non-partisan and stay in contact with all these different MPs who are constantly supporting the Tibetan cause. So on a personal level, I do maintain a special, I do maintain a personal relationship with all the MPs, like whether it's Randall Garrison, a very, very big supporter on the Hill. Randall is from NDP. Larry Bagnall, there's Vance Benjamin, there's James, there's Garnett. So there's a lot of MPs who support Tibet consistently. So just staying in contact with them and maintaining your own personal relationship is also very, very important. So these are the little like things that I have learned to handle and to maneuver and to see whenever there is a chance, there's a set criteria, but then how do you maneuver through that and navigate the system to somehow benefit, find a little loophole to benefit the Tibetan community or the cause that we are standing for or advocating for. And one of the biggest, for me, there was a lot of Tibetans who have come before me, right? Before, when we had the conservative government for 8 years, there was a lot of Tibetan staffers, especially like Tenzin Tagila, who's going to come on the panel. He's done a lot of incredible work. So for me to build upon that itself is a huge responsibility. And it's a little overwhelming sometimes to be working for an MP who is very well known in the Tibetan community across the globe as someone who's the face of, Tibetan Friends of Tibet or advocate for Tibet, like Arif is synonymous with now being really, really like passionate about Tibetan cause. And for me, that also adds a little bit of a pressure to be that person who's the liaison. And so everyone thinks that, oh, just because I work for Arif now, I can do everything and I can like help solve everything for the Tibetan community. It doesn't work that way sometimes. So learning to deal with these different pressures and it's also a bit of a challenge, but I think just anyone who wants to be part of the system, I think just learning and having that clarity is also really important. Yeah, and just like one of the things that I really take a lot of pride in is the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet internship program that I sort of within my role as a PFT coordinator in the last 4 years, we've sort of built upon that program, which I heard started by actually Tenzin Tagila. So yeah, so I'm sorry I missed your question, but because based on the topic, I just sort of prepared in terms of as an insider, what are the lessons you have learned as an assistant, as someone who works with an MP who is an advocate, a strong friend of Tibet, and then how do you navigate the system and still be undeterred and be resolute and be driven and not let all the side factors affect you and stay just resolute, right? And be that advocate as much as you can, because your foundation and what drives you has to be very, very clear. And as I said, because my experiences are very different from everyone here on the panel, like I've sort of, because I was born in Tibet, like I always try to stay undeterred and just stay focused and stay resolute in terms of what I have to do while, navigating through those limited opportunities to see what I can do best for the community. Yeah.
Thank you, Tenzin. So you touched on some really important points. One was the widespread support of all the parties with regards to Parliamentary Friends of Tibet. And I mean, there's different ways that the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet tries to support Tibetan human rights and of course encourage democratic freedoms in the country. One of the questions I'd like to ask you, which is very much in line with what you said, was how can Tibet advocates best leverage more Canada's support for human rights, for environmental preservation, as well as cultural preservation and other values that we have with that's aligned with what CTC is doing in terms of advocating on behalf of Tibetans. What are your thoughts about that in terms of experience? You touched on it a little bit. I mean, you touched on some really key.
Yeah. So, and this is, I'm going to be like, because now I've worked with, for the last 4 years as a constituency assistant and a PFT coordinator. So I'm speaking this entirely from experience. I think consistency is a #1 objective. I think we need to keep that in mind. Whenever you advocate for anything, right, it has to be consistent. We do have lobby days. We do have certain groups reach out to certain MPs or senators, but it's not consistent. So then the onus falls upon, like now Gafel is there, so it's going to fall on me and Gafel to follow up, right? To constantly connect with those MPs and constantly connect with the CTC or Office of Tibet to keep that momentum going. So for any advocacy group or Tibet friend group that Friends of Tibet group that we have, I think if you are advocating on any cause or issue, whether it's cultural preservation, whether it's, environmental issues, it has to be consistent. We have certain stakeholders who just come and email us constantly and don't leave the MP alone, right? So that's something that we are lacking in our community. And I get a little frustrated at times when I reach out to other people and say, why don't you reach out? Like when something is happening, nobody talks about it. Like when that fraudulent letter got with the new Tibetan Association formed under the, I don't know, the Chinese group, there were letters, forged letters with the PM's signature. We had just one community reach out, and then there was and then it just died, right? Like things like that. I'm saying you have to be consistent. So what we do in our capacity is that, like, for example, when His Holiness the Karmapa came to Ottawa for his first visit, because he's a very strong advocate for climate change, we used that opportunity to make him speak about environment, about climate change, about Tibet being the third pole, like to every individual he met, and saying that he is, a climate change activist, he's a gender activist. So, these are the opportunities we navigate. But as a advocacy group outside, I think like consistency is very, very important. So yeah, I think you have to keep pushing, keep doing the work on a consistent level, and then it pushes us to then work harder, right? Because right now I am a Tibetan working for an MP, but I have 500 different other responsibilities. I have 3,000 other stakeholders I need to contact, keep in touch with, right? So if I'm not reminded all the time about something, sometimes other things take priority, right? So, and it's really unfortunate, but there's a limited number of hours in a day. And, so you have to also learn how to prioritize and stuff. So that's why if advocacy groups have certain issues, you have to be consistent. And that's like my number one suggestion, speaking from experience. For example, with the $5.4 million in funding that the CTA and Agri team got, it was successful because it was a consistent effort. CTA, Office of Tibet, and CTC wouldn't leave me alone till that came about, right? Till that came into fruition. So, like, for us to go and constantly nudge the International Development Committee, whether it's the minister, whether it's the department, because like there was an email every week from CTA, we had to also push for it. And then because I'm a Tibetan, so then I take that extra responsibility. And one of the biggest thing about being an insider as a Tibetan, I think, in the system is that and this is a very good, I think, example also. When I was actually with Sikyong and Office of Tibet Representative and Sherpa and all of us in the International Development Office, meeting with the department people to advocate for their money. And I was speaking to them both as a Tibetan and as an assistant to a member. So I become one, right? I'm both inside and outside. So I think we need more Tibetans like that who can be part of the system, yet advocate for your own people, right? So that's such an important thing. So yeah, I'm sorry. So we should have more, advocacy should be consistent, and people who can advocate but also be part of the system is also really important. And then if you have people like Pujila who not only, worked for a provincial member, but then ran for office and now is an elected representative, right? So all of these things, to have these people in different levels, advocacy groups, but people who work in the offices, but people who are also elected officials, all of this, just staying in contact, maintaining good relationships and being consistent.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you, Tenzin. I think you raised
a lot of hand movement. I'm really sorry.
Hand movements are fine. That's fine. I think you raised a really good point about, it brings us back to the topic really of this panel, which is about being a part of the system, but you really need to have people be a part of the system as well as be linked to the outside of it as well, so that you're really forming that type of partnership and those networks that are really able to strengthen, which is really important. So thank you. Thank you, Tenzin. Our next speaker is going to be Dechen Tenzin. Dechen is a consistency assistant to the Ontario Parliamentary Friends of Tibet Chair, MPP Butila Karpoche. Dechen, thank you very much for joining us today. Could you talk to us a bit about your experience and about the Ontario Parliamentary Friends of Tibet that has been renewed under the leadership of MPP Butila Karpoche?
For sure. Hi, everyone. Deshale. Just want to thank you, Louisa and Sharabla and the Canada-Tibet Committee for organizing this. I think this is a great platform and an opportunity for us to share our experiences as well as the work that we do for the Tibet cause. Before I just speak on my experience, I just quickly want to go back to being part of the system. I think that, all of us on this panel, we're really privileged to be in these positions where we can leverage our position to speak, to amplify the voices of our community. And I think, if you're working for an MP, if you're working for an MPP, we have a foot in both doors. We're part of our Tibetan community, and we're part of, a political office. And to have a Tibetan person in a political office, that's something that, that kind of like support for Tibet, like, I think for us as working in political office, we have that power to push Tibet on our MP or MPP's agenda. So I just want to say, like, with being a part of the system, that's a privilege that we have, and that's something that we should continue to use. Just speaking on my experience, it's been a little over a year for me working as a constituency assistant. And when I see the panel here, I find myself in a unique position because I work for a Canadian politician who also happens to be a Tibetan, the member of provincial parliament, my boss, Putila Karpoche. Putila, as all of you would know, is the first person of Tibetan heritage to be elected to public office in North America. For many of us Tibetans, whether we're born as stateless peoples. And I think, whether we're born in Nepal or in India or anywhere outside of Tibet for that matter, as exiles, we've grown up experiencing political exclusion. So I think that's why it's such an incredible feat to have one of our own directly representing us in the halls of decision making and in the legislature here at Queen's Park in Ontario. And mind you, Putila didn't just get elected; she won by a landslide, which I think is a huge, it's a huge accomplishment. Anyways, for the past year, I've been primarily working as an outreach coordinator for Putila. For my work, I do a number of different organizing work, such as hosting community town halls, tabling, canvassing, connecting with local advocacy groups to make sure that Putila's work in the legislature reflects the needs of our larger community in Parkdale High Park. And at Putila's office, we're always looking for opportunities to support the Tibet cause. But mind you, we're part of the opposition. We're not part of the government. So our resources are limited compared to as if we are in the government. But we try to do what we can and as much as we can. Just to give a small example, yesterday we provided a letter of support for Tibetan Women's Association for a funding proposal. And similarly, we're constantly in touch with our community organizations and different sokpas to amplify their needs and to put Tibet first. So that's the kind of stuff that we can do at the provincial level. And as a Tibetan, I'm also a board member of Students for Free Tibet Canada. So the issue of Tibet is obviously close to my heart. My boss, Putila, is also, or was previously an active member of SFT as well. So through SFT, we're both connected, through SFT for Tibet. And of course, it was mentioned earlier, the riding that we represent in Parkdale is holds the largest concentration of Tibetans in Canada, which I think is both an opportunity for us as well as a responsibility, to further the Tibet cause whenever and wherever possible. So this was just a small background as to where I come from in terms of my work. And so now to your question about the OPFT, the OPFT stands for Ontario Parliamentary Friends of Tibet. It's a group of MPPs, nonpartisan MPPs, chaired by Putila herself, and they work together to make important contributions to the Tibet cause, as well as support the Tibetan-Canadian community here in Ontario. And OPFT acts as the voice of support for Tibet at the provincial level. Through the OPFT committee of MPPs, we have been able to launch a number of different initiatives to strengthen the Tibet cause. So till date, we have held 7 annual Tibet Day receptions at Queen's Park, which is attended by MPPs across the board and from different political parties. And at these kinds of events, we invite leaders of the Tibetan community and the different Sokpa reps, from Tibetan Women's Association, Regional Tibetan Youth Congress, from our community center as well. We invite them to mix and mingle, to make connections, the purpose of which ultimately is to advocate for the Tibet cause. Couple of other things we've done through the OPFT committee. We were also able to host Ngurupla last year. Ngurupla, as many of you would know, is His Holiness is North American Tibetan Rep from DC. And we were able to host Ngurupla and the delegation from DC to be introduced to the OPFT committee members, of which consists of both opposition as well as government side of MPPs, to discuss issues important to the Tibetan community. For example, supporting the preservation of Tibetan language, culture in the diaspora. So these are kind of meetings that we are able to host through OPFT, which is nonpartisan, and it's another way for us to help make key connections with figures in our community with politicians, right? And then through the OPFT last year, for the first time, we launched the OPFT Summer Youth Placement Program. This is a 6 weeks paid placement in May, and it's to provide Tibetan youth the opportunity to experience politics firsthand, to get the behind the scenes experience, as well as on the job learning of what it's like in a member of provincial parliament's office. Last year we had 4 youth. One of them is actually right here with Gafel. Great to see you here, by the way. So yeah, we had 4 youths last year, and they were placed in different offices. So for example, Gafel worked on the government side for a conservative MPP, and we also had another intern work in our office, the NDP office, which is in opposition. So as you can see, it's truly a nonpartisan program. And the aim of it is to give that opportunity for young Tibetans to experience and learn how a political office runs, how a political space works. And so that's the youth placement program. And this year we actually had plans to have more spots open up for the summer youth placement program, as well as to get more MPPs to join the OPFT committee. Unfortunately, with COVID, we had to stall our plans. But so these are some of the ways that we create opportunities for Tibetans, but also especially Tibetan youth, to get exposure to the functioning of governments, and which in turn fosters leadership skills that they can bring back to our community, right? So ultimately, there's no doubt that, under Putila's leadership, there is a very strong will to create space for Tibetans in general, especially for youth to connect, to learn, to grow. And my role is to support these kinds of initiatives every step of the way. And lastly, what I want to add is, as a young Tibetan growing up in the West, there are so many challenges that we experience trying to stay connected with our community, with our culture, with our roots. And so this job, or the work that I'm currently doing, puts me in a perfect spot where I'm able to be part of the larger Canadian political world, as well as have a foot in my community, and so act as kind of a link between the two.
That's great. Thank you, Dachen. I think what I was going to ask you, you just mentioned it as a young Tibetan woman, and all of you are actually quite young, a bit younger than me, I think. But as a young Tibetan woman, one of the questions I wanted to ask you was, how do you think Tibetans can build beyond, like young Tibetans, youth can build beyond, for example, a network of Tibet supporters beyond that are just Tibetan, that are actually considering other constituencies and other people within Canada. So how do you build that network as a young Tibetan? And all of you, I'd invite you all to bring a few comments about that. How can we expand the network so it's not just young Tibetans, but it really goes beyond in society?
For sure. I think I appreciate your question. I think that building a network of Tibet supporters should go beyond just the youth responsibilities. I honestly feel like we're all in great positions here on this panel, which makes it easier for us. But I think for any Tibetan, in any capacity, in your place of work, in wherever you go to school, whether it's in a nurse, if you go to school, if you work in a nursing home, with wherever you work, I think every Tibetan can be an ambassador for Tibet in their own capacity. And I don't necessarily think just for March 10th, we need, solidarity or, have non-Tibetans come out. So I think every Tibetan can, be ambassadors for Tibet in their own way. But I think another thing that I want to point out also, it was mentioned by Yuden earlier. I think sometimes we Tibetans tend to be consumed in our own struggles, which is of course valid. But I also think in this day and age of like social media, I think it's critical that we're aware of struggles of other people that are similar to ours. And and just as we expect support for our cause, I think it's so important for us to realize that we need to be there for their struggles as well. If you take the case of like Black Lives Matter today, the struggle, that how different is that from from our own struggles in the fight for basic rights for Tibetans in Tibet? And I think it's so important that we reflect on these, like Yudin was mentioning earlier about climate justice movements, but there's also indigenous struggles here in Canada. And I think, had it not been for the solidarity of, individuals, governments, non-Tibetans, all over the world, the Tibet issue today, couldn't have gotten as far as we're here. And it's because that we're, Tibetans and non-Tibetans alike together are, working for Tibet that, we're able to get as much of a support as we're currently having. So yeah, I think solidarity is key. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Solidarity. It's a resounding theme that keeps coming out in this panel discussion, really is about networking, solidarity, building partnerships and building alliances to be able to push forward Tibetan human rights. So thank you for those insights. Last but not least, of course, finally, we have with us our former executive director, and it's a pleasure for me to introduce you, Tenzin. Tenzin Dargyal Kangsar. Tenzin is a man of many hats, and you probably would have seen him in many different events, many different circumstances. I
have to wear a hat because I'm bald, right? So that's why.
There we go. So he's a man of many hats. And one of them, of course, is an impact investor, a venture capitalist, an investment banker, an entrepreneur. And he's been a chief of staff to several ministers during his stay in Ottawa with the Canadian government, including Minister of Industry, to the President of the Treasury Board, to the Director of Multicultural Affairs, and to the Minister of Citizenship, Immigration, and Multiculturalism. And he was, again, I'm going to say, he was the former Executive Director of the Canada-Tibet Committee. Tenzin, as one of the most experienced Tibet advocates, you've been able to be involved in the Canadian government in different capacities on different levels. Can you talk to us about your experience of working as Chief of Staff to various offices and share words of advice to young Tibetans working in similar platforms and advocating for Tibet in Canada? Thank you for joining us today.
Sure. Nice to see you again, Louisa. I love your haircut, by the way. I think maybe before I jump straight to the Chief of Staff, I think it'd be helpful to share with everyone kind of my journey, how I got there, right? So it's not like I just woke up and suddenly I was the Chief of Staff. But, I owe a lot of my kind of formation and, my pride in being a Tibetan, by way of background, I grew up in rural Quebec, right? So I think I was one of 8 Tibetans where I grew up. We are the OGs of Tibetans immigrating to the West way back in 1971. And, frankly, I grew up most of my life being, rural Quebec can be tough. I'll just leave it at that, right? There's a lot of systemic racism in rural Quebec. But, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right, in life. So having said that, even though we were a small community and then moving to Montreal where there were a lot more Tibetans at 110, right? That's a huge number back in the day. People like Thupten Samdullah, right? The founder of Canada Tibet Committee. I want to give a lot of credit and a shout out to him for being, an incredible bridge between my parents and the young generation, right? I'm no longer young at 48, But back then, he was a key bridge. So if that's a role that I could play today, I'd be honored to be half as impactful as Tupten Samdula to today's youth. I am of that Gen X, right? So there's kind of above and below me. But Tupten played a huge role in getting us engaged at an early age. I would encourage all youth to kind of find out. We all know I don't know if you call it a jojo or an uncle and an auntie. I don't know what's the proper term, right? Hopefully you call me jojo and not uncle. But if I would encourage all the youth to reach out to people that have experience, right? It's there's networking beyond. There's networking to parliamentarians and important donors, but just network within your own community and reach out and seek that wisdom that's within our own culture, right? The answer is often within, right? I'm sure that resonates for us as Buddhists. So Tupten was critical, being very active in Canada Tibet Committee since I was a teenager. We didn't have SFT back in the day. I probably would have been an SFT member, but it didn't exist back then, and neither did email and the internet. So through that, we were exposed to politicians. And then again, coming back to the theme of authentic, meaningful relationships, that's how we befriended, politicians from all parties, the Bloc Québécois, the Green Party, the Liberals, the Conservatives, right, at the Senate or the MP. So the root of that is just authentic, real relationships. And when you have that in life, then I guess you could use the word leverage. You leverage that then to level up your own kind of journey, right? And ideally, those relationships should not be based on a transaction. They're actually because you share certain values and you see the same North Star, whether that's frankly making money or helping to find freedom for the Tibetan people, right? So I think by accident or by design, those relationships were true, they were real. And then through my work through the CTC, I was approached by a couple of parties prior to the 2006 election, right, 2006, to run. And, I was honored, I was flattered. There were friends from all parties. And I decided to, by the way, back then, 2006, I was 32 years old. I was more interested in business in Tibet. And I thought all the parties were the same, frankly. I said, oh, you guys are all the same. You're all full of, you know what. But then as I did more Tibet lobbying work, I actually understood that, they actually, there's actually, if you take the time to study their policy positions, they're very different, right? And ultimately we have to vote. Like my whole life, I voted Liberal because that's all I knew what to do. But as I studied more in who I was, then based on my values, based on my entrepreneurial background, I felt more at home with the Conservatives, right? So that's just my own journey. And so decided to run for the Conservatives. Unfortunately, I lost my election in 2006, but Stephen Harper and the party won, right? So I share this with everyone is because, you have to kind of take calculated risks in the beginning, right? If you're a startup entrepreneur, employee number one gets rewarded and becomes very rich if you're at Facebook, right? Same thing with politics. If any of you, it doesn't matter what party you're with, if you go in at the ground level and you come in at the early days and you kind of pick or identify a rising star or a rising party, like there will be a nice ROI, a return on investment later, right? Because I've seen firsthand in my years and then promoted to a chief of staff, I would add the only non-white chief of staff, there. So not only Tibetans, but a lot of other diverse staffers were really kind of, I found out after the fact, but they were kind of rooting for me and watching my every move. But I think just authentic relationships and paying your dues in those early days before someone is big, if you're with them in the beginning, whether it's a party or whether it's a politician, the ROI is huge afterwards, right? Because it's all about loyalty and relationships in politics, right? They'll remember you for that. So for example, I'm just going to throw out there, if I personally hope Arif becomes a cabinet minister one day, obviously that will have, Tenzila will also kind of follow on his coattails, right? And be in a even stronger position to do the great work that she's doing, right? So it's just these types of thinking that I hope the people on this kind of video call can take with them. Get in early on the ground floor and then take some risks, right?
That's great. Thank you so much, Tenzin. Absolutely. I mean, I think sharing your journey of where you started and how you were able to take on different roles and also have a lot of influence. And I think your experience too at CTC certainly helped provide that insight into being able to do more and promote more on a larger level for Tibetans actually within Canada. So that's really great. Thank you. How do you think now, in which ways maybe we can leverage more at this current time, considering what's happening now in the world and all the current discussions regarding China and foreign policy and the Canadian government? How do you think that Tibet advocates can leverage at this time?
Yeah, well, that's a big question to unpack, right? So you kind of have to, I mean, we live in an environment where frankly, nobody knows anything, right? Doesn't matter what title you have, nobody knows anything on CEOs, heads of states. So I think what we do know is we have, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party in power. That the provinces don't usually have much of an impact on foreign policy in the matters of, call it the Tibetan freedom struggle. The provinces do have a very important role, by the way, for, on, let's call it healthcare or education. These are important matters to the Tibetan community as well. I don't want to discount that, but sticking to what I know well, which is federal politics, we do know stress about what you can control and don't stress about what you can't. So we do know who is in control now is, Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party. I think we have to be very mindful of what are the levers and the triggers for this prime minister and this party, and just be very strategic about that. We have, thankfully we have senior Tibetans now in all parties. So, it's no secret for me to share that I think part of our inspiration to start the Parliamentary Friends of Tibet was just modeling against what the Jewish community did, right? So I was there in Ottawa, and there were Jewish students in every minister's office and MP's office. And we said, a few of us, well, why not do this for Tibetans, right? So that was we were just copying something that worked really well. We did it for Tibetans. And in fact, I think we should be very proud that for the size of our community, like we were ahead of much other bigger communities, including Indians and Ukraine. The Ukrainians copied us, the Polish copied us after, right? So we really punch above our weight as Tibetans, right? So I think to come back to your question, it's a very complex one. I'd like to stay positive on this call, but we have to accept the reality of how this prime minister and this government views China first and foremost. I don't see this government making an isolated decision just on Tibet or just on His Holiness. We have to be mindful and realistic and, manage our own expectations. So within the kind of the liberal government view of China, what can we get done? I think we have to be realistic about that. I still believe we need, let's say, the SFTers to ask for complete independence and the abolishment of China's one China policy. I will point out with some pride, you may have seen the very ambitious foreign policy on China that Aaron O'Toole, who was a legitimate contender to be Prime Minister of Canada, put out there. So these are things that, we Tibetans should influence on the leadership platforms of all parties, right? So hopefully Aaron and if you guys don't know what I'm talking about, I invite you to go see his website. And Aaron O'Toole, specifically on foreign policy in China, specifically calls out the Tibetan people, specifically calls out a negotiated settlement with His Holiness. So this is unprecedented. It doesn't matter what, conservative or liberal or NDP leading you have, right? So I think these are things we can take back to our respective parties and say, look, this has been done. The floor has been set. Let's keep leveling up, right? I'm at long story short, I'm at a loss. I'm not really sure what we can expect from this liberal government as it pertains to the Tibet issue on foreign policy. I do think we can expect a lot of continued support for Tibetans in Canada, whether that's infrastructure funding or immigration help, or I think that's a much less sensitive issue for this government, right?
So that was actually one of the questions that we got from the audience, from someone who's following in, was what do we think we can expect really from the Canadian government in terms of being able to advance Tibetan human rights and in terms of policy? And I think, Tenzin, you just answered it, that at this stage, with any government, we really don't know what to expect, really, in a lot of ways, as times are changing, and it's a much more complex issue, really, because it affects many different factors. So I think you already answered that question, so thank you for that. There was a question from the audience too about what do we think really, how should the Canadian government, any Canadian government perhaps be when it comes to Chinese foreign policy in terms of negotiations, in terms of standing strong on certain themes, on certain items that are incredibly important. Do any of you have any thoughts about that in terms of approach? You've talked a lot in this panel about the importance of building solidarity, the importance of having relationships and building alliances. Are there any thoughts from any of you about what should the stance be? And what does it mean, really? Like, what can we really think in terms of, if there is a stance, what does that have? What are the implications of that stance overall in terms of Tibetans and pushing things forward? Anybody want to dare take that one? That's a big one, I know. Gaffa, were you going to say something?
Yeah, sure. I think a place to start would be recognizing that we are in a kind of strategic rivalry relationship with China. I think, for my own personal view, is that for quite a while, in the last few years, the relationship has been more based around trade and investment and economic concerns. They're sort of taking primacy over geopolitical interests, and even human rights, and sort of these other concerns that have kind of been sidelined over maintaining relationships and sort of building a new status quo around economic relationships. So I think a good start would be recognizing that China as as a rival global power exists in sort of a strategic relationship with liberal democracies like Canada and the United States and countries of Europe. That there is, it is to a certain degree the case that the values and interests, politically and otherwise, are sort of at conflict, and burying that tension underneath the rug doesn't do us any good. It's something you need to recognize, and I think it's a good basis for building good policy.
Great, thank you, Gafa. You done? Did you want to say? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
to add on to that, I think there is a shift in both in North America. I think in the US, we've seen bills where they've called out for freedom of Tibet. I think that's huge. I think there's shift in North America in the public perception of what is important. And I think we can sort of capitalize on that moving forward. Perhaps not necessarily with the Liberal government, but I think there is, in the public perception, there's a shift, and I think that would influence MPs as well moving forward.
Yeah, so to build upon Tinsla and Gaffel and Yudun, I'm actually really happy Tinsla came and spoke, from his experience and so much of wisdom and insight to share with the younger aspiring people who want to work for politicians or stand for election, right? To run for office eventually. So just like, he's right now, I think, literally, just like how Tinsla explained, everything is very uncertain, right? And we have to, as Tibetans, have to have a wholesome understanding of what Canada's priority is and Canada's interest is, what Canada's relationship with China and America and India and all this other country looks like, and whatever opportunity we have right now. There's a new Canada-China committee that's recently been established. Earlier it used to be Foreign Affairs. Now all China-related matters will be dealt through the Canada-China committee, right? So taking advantage of things like that to ensure that what our stand, unified stand or voice is, just always to push it through those different mediums that we have on the Hill, and use people who are friends or supporters or advocates for your cause, use them and constantly stay in touch with them, maintain a meaningful relationship, like Tinsla said, maintain a meaningful relationship, authentic relationship that's not based on transactions of what you can do for you, or what you can do for me, or what I can do for you kind of a thing. Just maintain that relationship and use those mediums to push your agenda forward. And it works, in many cases. In my experience in the last 4 years, I've seen it work. So yeah, just.
Great, thank you, Tenzin. Absolutely. I think there's been a lot of mention about consistency and being constant. Go ahead, Dechen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add really quickly. Just felt that in terms of foreign policy, I think Canada prides itself on having that moral authority, and so I personally believe that we don't compromise on Canadian values, that we like to be so proud of as Canadians, and take up human rights with China up front. And I think locally at grassroots levels, supporting the organizations like SFT that are the leading Tibetan youth organization for freedom, for human rights, foreign policy wise, if Canada can't take a stand under this government or whatever, supporting these grassroots organizations that are actually doing the work on the ground. And I think, for those that are in positions where they are able to provide that support, I think it's very important to provide that funding, to provide that support. So that's all I just wanted to add.
Hey, Louisa, if I may, I just want to jump in here really quickly. So I'm actually more excited than I've ever been as a Tibetan and as a Tibet activist, because COVID is the great global reset, right? I've always been of the view that China will never just give us freedom, or, you know, umelam, or whatever you call it, right? They'll only do it when they're in a position of weakness. So I think I see those tectonic, you know, plates being shifted right now as we speak. The whole world, you know, if you look at some of the polling and the Pew studies, the China's brand has never been as negative as it is today. And I think the most negative was way back in Tiananmen massacre, and maybe many of your viewers weren't even born then, right? But that was like all the way back to '89, right? So I think this is, you know, if you look at the history of the world, whether it's the collapse of the Soviet Union, or kind of the Berlin Wall falling, it starts, the totalitarian regime starts to get weak. And that's our opportunity to kind of, you know, put in a big Tibetan shoehorn and make that crack much bigger, right? So I think I'm personally very excited. And I think, you know, to Denzila's point, we have to be very strategic. I'm sure the good leaders in Dharamsala are thinking of things as we have this chat, but everyone has the role to do, right? So I'm very optimistic that all political parties, left or right, will have more courage to stand up to China today. I'm very optimistic about that, because it's now in their political local voter interests. Look at the United States. It's Biden and Trump are trying to, you know, out anti-China themselves, right? And Pompeo is making statements on, you know, Panchen Lama. This is unprecedented, right? And we have to also be mindful that it's a little bit of local politics, you know, yeah, I'm very excited about the current times of COVID and the shifting away even of our business supply chains from China, right? So this is a great time for us to double down on whatever we're doing, right?
So you touched on a little bit a few of the other questions that came through from the viewers. One was, you know, as a Canadian government, what should our stance be? And I think that all of you touched on that a little bit in terms of, you know, trying to promote Canadian values. And I think Tenzin, you just talked about it being an opportunity now with the changes going on around the world to actually be able to leverage China in a way that perhaps, you know, hasn't been seen before in some ways. So there definitely are opportunities to be able to try to do that and try to promote as much as possible. And I think all of you in different ways have had, and you mentioned it, Dechen, have had the privilege in some ways to be a part of this system, to see what can be done within the Canadian government system at different levels, to see how each of you too have taken on the responsibility of promoting Tibetan human rights and democratic freedoms, which is incredibly important, being an inspiration and also empowering the people around you, trying to build networks, also trying to build more alliances and relationships, and keep building and building to make sure that Tibet really does stand out and it stays in the spotlight. And I think the things that are happening now, as you mentioned, Tenzin, about the Panchen Lama being mentioned, there's a lot of things that are starting to shift. And you mentioned that about there's things shifting. We see a lot more youth engaged, and it's wonderful. This is one of the reasons why we're having this panel, really, is to try to empower more of the youth to get involved. It's not just about Tibetans, it really is about everyone. So it's looking beyond to it's engaging young Tibetans, and it's engaging the whole community, really. It's engaging everybody to be a part of this and to see the importance. And that's what His Holiness talks about, really. It's about the interrelatedness and about it being universal responsibility rather than it just being on one person. So in closing, I would like to thank all of you for your insights. You've all had really interesting experiences in working within the Canadian government in different levels. You've all been able to share your excitement, the ways that you've been inspired, the ways that you do inspire and take action on Tibet within your communities, within your ridings, also within the work that you do for SFT and also in other ways. Tenzin Kengzar, we know your journey has been long. We've seen you in a lot of different ways, but we also know the value it really has being able to speak out on different levels of the Canadian government and being engaged in different ways. And does make an impact. A lot of things are in the works and a lot of things are developing, and it's important to always have that involvement in a lot of different ways. So I want to thank you all sincerely for being a part of this panel. I believe we've achieved our goal, really, of talking about your experiences, your shared experiences, and being a part of the system. All of you have mentioned the importance of also gaining support and solidarity of people who are not necessarily within the system, but who are people who can contribute and really be valuable players in trying to promote Tibetan issues all around the country. This is something that we can all do. I always say that we can always make a difference. We can, absolutely, in many different ways. And this is a takeaway message I think that we need to bring forward as we're going through COVID, but even without COVID, it really is, you know, responsibility to talk and to make things happen. And it's one thing to talk about things, but it's another thing to take action. So I'm going to bring back some of the comments that were made by Gatha in the beginning about speaking to your MPs, about raising your voice, about getting involved, ensuring that we really are doing what we can to try to promote things as much as possible. And we are seeing things happen, just like you throw a pebble in the ocean, you start with one ripple and things take off and they become bigger and bigger as time goes on. So I do want to thank you all very much for talking about your experience working within the Canadian government, also about your roles and how you've taken on certain responsibilities to try to promote Tibetan human rights and the democratic freedoms within the government, within your own communities, and how that has taken on different life forms outside of it. So a sincere, heartfelt thanks for all of you for participating. I hope that for all of you viewers, we've almost had about 80 viewers, which I think is great for our Wednesday afternoon. I think it shows the interest and the importance of talking about these issues. This is a pivotal time for Tibet. Tibet has to stay in the spotlight, and this is a part of it. Having these kind of online panel discussions is a part of ensuring Tibet remains at the forefront as much as possible. I want to direct you to the Canada-Tibet Committee website. You can find more information there. We do all kinds of different things. We are very dedicated to doing advocacy. It's really the main thing the CTC does, is advocate with the Canadian government. So the website is www.tibet.ca. I also want to direct you to Facebook for all of you. Please do join us. We're on social media in a lot of ways. I encourage you all to remain involved and engaged as much as you can. Talk to your networks, talk to everybody. Everybody needs to learn and grow and can be taught different things. And I think that's what we're experiencing more and more when we talk about Tibet, and really in light with what His Holiness says about building compassion overall. And compassion means action. So it's not passive. It really is very much an active word in a lot of senses. So thank you all very much for joining us. I wish you all the best going forward. Stay safe, be well, and please do tune into the Canada-Tibet Committee and the important work that we do in really trying to continue to promote Tibetan human rights overall. So thank you. I wish you all a lovely afternoon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Bye.